Hey everybody, we are here to talk about Rose's Dopefiend. So I'm going to have some introductions. We'll have Lisa go first.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm your TA, and this is
I'm Nate. I'm your other TA.
two for the price of one.
Yeah, exactly. And some of you might know one or the other of them better if you are in a group with them. And they both took U.S. Society with me as undergrads, so they are back in full force to talk about Rose's Dopefiend, or kind of introduce the book to you this first week. So we wanted to talk a little bit first about the idea of cultural relativism. There is a little, I think, a slide or two on cultural relativism in the PowerPoint, but we wanted to talk a little bit more about what it means and how we think it applies here. So you want to say what you think?
Yeah, so when you're reading this book, you may find some things kind of shocking, and we encourage you to kind of just take a look at that and try to understand it from the perspective of these homeless people at the time and the people in these situations, and kind of just suspend your current ideas and just try to understand the situation from their perspective, and kind of just suspend some of your possible judgments about their life, because they are intravenous drug users in San Francisco living in poverty, and so it's just important and helpful for understanding the text to kind of just take their perspective on for the purpose of this book.
Mm-hmm.
As you go further in the book, you'll find it a lot easier to see things from their perspective because you start learning their stories, which is actually one of the things that makes this book highly readable. But at first, in the first couple chapters, there are some things that might seem a little outrageous or shocking or even gross, and you just kind of have to take it in stride and believe that it's coming from a unique perspective from a group of people that have their own way of seeing the world.
Yeah. And while a lot of them do have stories that they come out of poverty or situations that may not be relatable to our students, I remember reading this book and feeling pretty actually shocked that a lot of their stories their trajectories were very similar to people that I know, and it's just very interesting to learn that and understand that even though they ended up in this position of very, very, very low poverty, that a lot of them have similar backgrounds and stories to a lot of people we may know and know about.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons I assigned this book is to really challenge everybody to think about what it means to be a sociologist, to think about how do we look at a social problem objectively, how do we look at homeless, drug addiction, and try to understand it from a theoretical standpoint and from a more critical standpoint that allows us to understand the social structures, the cultural imperatives, all the different things that are happening in our society that actually allow this type of really, really challenging and difficult and in some cases, just heart-wrenching situations to happen. I think we can't necessarily like the Wright and Rogers book says, we can't place all of the blame on the people who are, in this case, potentially victims of a system that doesn't really serve them very well. So I think that the challenge with cultural relativism or with having a sociological imagination is to really think about how this conveys a range of different sociological concepts. And your challenge in writing that final paper on Righteous Dopefiend is to make the connections. What do you see that's happening in this book that relates to all the things we've talked about in Wright and Rogers already? The idea is that these things actually, I assigned a lot of the chapters to stand next to the Wright and Rogers material because so much of it does overlap and go together. And so I think that as Nate and Lisa point out, it's really difficult sometimes because these stories can be so difficult to read, especially if you know someone or you have had experiences like this. It's hard, but it's also really rewarding if you can suspend some of that judgment and think really critically about what else is going on here that makes these outcomes really occur. One other thing we wanted to highlight here was just some of the issues of language and maybe some of the fact that the images are here as well. We know that there's some rough language, that there's lots of swearing, that there's lots of uses of some language we might not necessarily always want to use in the classroom, but I think that you'll see that the people who have written the book, the ethnographers here, they're really doing it because they're trying to be true to the people that they're studying. And so I think eventually, like with any, it's almost kind of like Shakespeare. You kind of get to know the language of this particular community, and it makes more sense the more you read it. And some of the things that might at first seem abrasive or abrupt end up becoming second nature because it's part of the way that this community functions. So we want to highlight that. I know that the pictures as well are a little graphic, but just try and take it in stride. If you have a really hard time with the pictures, there's no reason you can't, skip one or two and not have to focus on those so much. Another thing we wanted to highlight was maybe some things that Lisa had to say about relationships in the book.
Oh, yeah. One thing about this really interesting understanding the relationships in the book is you see a lot of really close, dependent, symbiotic relationships between the different characters in the book. And while their relationships may imitate many of the relationships we're used to having with friends and family because they're dependent on each other, there's also this deep ingrained sense in a lot of the people in the book that they have to take care of themselves. So while we may see the people in the book being very caring and loving, we see the moral economy, which is taking care of other drug users when they're in withdrawal, but we also see them acting very selfishly as well, and we see them doing things that we're looking at and we don't understand why they're doing these actions and hurting people that they care about, but we also have to remember the context that they're in and the fact that they have to constantly be watching out for themselves because in this community, not taking care of yourself and not being selfish could mean you die. It could mean that you don't have drugs you need for yourself that night. So the implications for the relationships are a lot higher.
And this is actually one of the points where their use of a theoretical framework really helps to keep the authors from portraying the characters as caricatures, as just being outrageous in and of themselves. They utilize the moral economy, and they also have this concept of habitus that basically describes an individual's idea of the structure of society and their place in it. As Pete Collier put it in his Sociology of Higher Education course, habitus can basically be defined as what is possible for someone like me. And it's a product of socialization, so it's a product of the structure of society and everybody's place coming up through it.
Yeah, and so you're going to see a lot of different theoretical concepts being unveiled throughout the course of reading this book. There really is a grounding in some more of the kind of Marxist theories and some a lot of Bourdieu. Habitus comes from the writings of Bourdieu, and I think you'll be able to understand those theories a little bit more because they're kind of so accessible in the way that they're writing about them here. And I think it's fine if you're the kind of person where maybe this is, theory is a little challenging for you and this is not necessarily something you're most interested in. I think that you can kind of look at these concepts, see them being exemplified by one of the ideas that they're writing about here. And if you're also like a big theory nerd, like these two might be, then you can really dig a little deeper and understand some of those theories that maybe you've read before, and you can understand them in a new way. So we definitely wanted to highlight habitus and continue to remind you that that's important. One of the other themes or reasons why I assigned this book is because I want you to think about the notion of the unintended consequences of all of our different structural systems in the United States. So as you go through the book, you'll see all of these ways in which there are political systems, healthcare systems, police and law enforcement structures that actually, in a lot of ways are set up to deal with kind of average, law-abiding, middle-class white citizens. And when it comes to populations like the Edgewater homeless, the theory, the concepts, the structures, the systems and laws that are in place sort of fall apart. They don't necessarily apply very well to this population. And what you'll see in each of these chapters is that some of these structural things that might serve the generic population don't do anything except create a lot of actual tensions and problems. There's unintended consequences here throughout the book in terms of ways in which there will, some kind of intervention will be posited in terms of healthcare or in terms of the police, and it actually makes things much more difficult for folks and puts them in more precarious situations. So we want you to kind of continue to be looking for those types of ideas or concepts or examples. Do you want to add anything about other concepts that you really like or think are important?
I think that that there are some very, very fascinating theoretical concepts introduced that are actually in just a few pages in the introduction that are very, very helpful, including habitus and the moral economy, and they touch a little bit on the gray zone of just about anything goes for survival in this environment. And they touch on Foucault and the knowledge-power nexus, and a lot of these things are things that you'll gain a much better understanding of as the book goes on. And by the end of the book, you'll have a basic fundamental understanding of these concepts. And if this is something that really grabs your attention or your interest, then I would highly recommend trying to get a better understanding early on in the book, and that will help you grasp the stories and the characters and the structure of their world much better throughout.
Yeah, and, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to touch on what you were saying about language earlier and understanding. I think there's a contextual point to understand as well that in this community, the people who live on the Edgewater, that race is one of their only statuses that they have. They don't have wealth, they don't have other statuses, so race becomes way more pronounced and a much more dividing use of a much greater dividing line between people. So that's, I think, another thing important to understand when reading some of these this language that might be racist or not make you uncomfortable, is kind of understanding the context within which they're using it.
And that ties into intimate apartheid that they cover in depth later on in the book.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe a good enough introduction for today. I think we just want to remind you to kind of enjoy this. I think that this book in particular, it again, like I said in the first introductory lecture in the PowerPoint, this is something that students continually say that they really enjoy about the class, that makes this class different and makes it exciting. And so although there's some challenges and some difficulties, really try and get in there and you know, enjoy these stories and try and understand what's going on in these people's world and try and apply these sociological concepts in ways that will illuminate the ideas that are happening here. Again, we don't, you know, I didn't assign this because I want you to sit down and be like, oh God, look at these crazy drug users. That is not the purpose at all. The purpose here is to understand unique stories that we don't get to hear a lot about. If you read this introduction and you do it thoughtfully and carefully, you see that Philippe and Jeff, the authors, are really trying very hard to shed light on a population that's usually invisible, that we tend to not talk about, that we don't give a lot of attention to. And I think this gives us a really great opportunity to talk about public health issues, to talk about race and gender and class in really different ways. So I really hope that you'll enjoy the book as much as the three of us do, and hopefully that will spark some lively discussions on the discussion board. So if you have questions or thoughts, get in touch with any of us, maybe hopefully the person who's in charge of your group, but any of us will answer your emails, and we wish you luck in reading this.